What if the PC setup you spent $3,000 perfecting a decade ago is now the exact thing making your build look embarrassing today?
A Vietnamese tech reviewer who has been building and reviewing PCs since 2017 just dropped a video that is quietly one of the most brutal confessions I have seen from someone inside the industry. And it is not brutal because he is roasting some brand or dragging a scammy product. It is brutal because he is roasting his own past self. And by extension, every single one of us who lived through the golden age of PC gaming aesthetics. He sat down, looked back at almost 10 years of content, and admitted something most creators never admit on camera. The trends he used to evangelize, the builds he used to flex, the exact aesthetic he helped popularize to thousands of viewers are now dead weight, out of style, out of touch. And the audience reaction underneath that video is even more revealing than the video itself. Because you get to watch real PC builders, real 30-somethings with families now. Real people who spend actual money chasing these trends, either nod along in painful agreement or push back hard enough to start genuine arguments in the replies. This is not a nostalgia trip. This is a referendum on an entire era of consumer tech culture, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it in your own setup right now.
Let's start with the trend that built an entire secondary economy around a color spectrum, RGB lighting. Back around 2017 and 2018, RGB was not just a feature, it was a religion. And I mean that literally, because the reviewer walks through exactly how insane the pricing got. Plain, non-RGB RAM kits were the boring default. If you wanted lit-up memory sticks, you paid a premium that today would make 0 cents. And if you already owned a plain kit, or an older DDR3 kit with zero lighting, companies like Zodak were literally selling separate RGB heat spreader shells you could clip onto your existing RAM just to fake the glow. Let that sink in for a second. People were buying plastic RGB shrouds to snap onto memory they already owned because the chip itself refused to light up. There were even dummy RGB RAM sticks, meaning fake memory modules with zero function, sold purely so your motherboard slots looked fully populated and glowing. That is not a product category, that is a cry for help disguised as a market.
And it did not stop at memory. Case fans followed the same insane logic. A cheap, no-name RGB fan back then could run you the equivalent of $40, which for a basic cooling component is a wild markup purely for color. Meanwhile, there were companies selling standalone RGB rings you could physically bolt onto a plain, high-performance fan just to fake the lighting effect, because the good fans without RGB existed, but nobody wanted them anymore. Cases got glass front panels, with fans mashed directly against the glass, and here is the part that should annoy anyone who actually understands airflow. That placement did nothing for cooling performance. It existed purely so the RGB glow looked good pressed against the window. Function sacrificed entirely for a photo opportunity. GPUs, motherboards, even RAM heat spreaders that had zero business needing illumination, all of it got the RGB treatment because the entire market was captured by a single aesthetic trend and everyone with disposable income, or without it honestly, was FOMOing into the glow.
Here's where it gets interesting though, because the comment section split almost perfectly down generational and lifestyle lines. One commenter, a 34-year-old, laid out exactly why RGB fell off for him personally. It spins, it distracts, and it makes the case run hotter for zero functional gain. But then another 34-year-old jumped in with a direct contradiction, arguing RGB fans are non-negotiable for airflow regardless of the lighting, and that you can just turn the LEDs off if they bother you. That is a legitimately unresolved debate happening in real time under a video about a trend supposedly being dead. One viewer nailed the actual reason RGB isn't gone, it evolved. He pointed out that rainbow RGB chaos is out, but single-color builds and edge-lit accents are the new meta, keeping things clean while still having a signature look. That tracks exactly with what the reviewer said about now running his own lighting on a schedule, blue in the daytime for a fresh feel, amber at night to ease eye strain, dimming further before bed. RGB did not die. It got disciplined.
Now let's talk about the trend that turned garages and desks into science experiments. Custom water cooling. This one hits different because the money involved is genuinely staggering when you hear it laid out plainly. The reviewer says builders with a total system value around $500 were still willing to drop an extra $120, sometimes more, purely to install a custom water loop. Read that ratio again. A budget build getting nearly a quarter of its total cost dumped into cooling that existed almost entirely for visual flex. GPU manufacturers leaned into it hard too, releasing dedicated water block editions of their flagship cards during the era of cards like the GTX 1080 and RTX 2080, and enthusiasts were routinely spending $400 to over $1,000 just on the loop itself, completely separate from the actual PC components doing the computing.
But here's the controversial part buried in the comments, and it is where the video's clean trend is dead narrative gets genuinely messy. Multiple commenters, including someone clearly self-identifying with a nickname referencing a legendary DIY water cooling builder in the Vietnamese tech scene, brought up wild custom loop projects, including one for a Nintendo Switch that people described as looking like a walkie-talkie strapped to your chest. That is either the most impressive or most unhinged flex in PC culture history, depending on who you ask, and the comments genuinely could not agree which. Meanwhile, another commenter described being stuck with a custom loop on an RTX 3080 Aorus card because he cannot afford to upgrade, so he is stuck maintaining a system he now considers a liability rather than a flex, joking that slapping an AIO cooler onto that GPU instead would look, in his words, obscene. And then there is the guy who bought a used water-cooled block on a 2015-era GTX 980 Ti, only to spend 3 years replacing pumps and coolant, essentially paying a maintenance tax for aesthetics that modern AIO coolers eliminate entirely.
That maintenance risk is exactly the reviewer's central argument. Even a perfectly built custom loop carries a non-zero risk of leaking, and one commenter described watching an entire water cooling shop have to compensate a customer for fried components after a leak destroyed the build. That is the nightmare scenario every custom loop owner quietly accepts as the cost of the aesthetic. And it is exactly why the market has shifted toward all-in-one liquid coolers, which have matured enough that they close most of the performance gap while removing almost all of the risk. One viewer summed up the entire shift in a single sarcastic line, joking that spending big on a custom loop just meant you couldn't afford to upgrade your GPU anyway, so you doubled down on the cooling instead. Brutal, but not entirely wrong.
Trend number 3 might be the one that generates the most genuine disagreement in the entire comment section, and it is gaming chairs. The reviewer says he personally cycled through an enormous number of gaming chairs between 2017 and 2022, from premium brands to budget options, even trying a double chair setup at one point. And his argument against them now is oddly specific and honestly compelling. In Vietnam's hot, humid climate, gaming chairs made of any kind of leather or pleather become a sweat trap unless you are sitting in air conditioning. Without AC, you get stuck skin, discomfort, and eventually the material starts peeling or bubbling, regardless of whether it is genuine leather or synthetic. His replacement recommendation is the ergonomic office chair with a mesh back, which breathes far better whether or not the room has climate control, and which is built for the reality that many PC users are not gaming for an hour in the evening. They are sitting at that desk for entire workdays plus gaming sessions on top.
This is where the comments get genuinely heated, and I mean that as both a pun and a fact. one person flatly disagreed, saying that if you have enough money, you can absolutely find a gaming chair that avoids the stuffy, sweaty feeling and provides a comfortable, non-fatiguing sit. Another commenter pushed back even harder on the reviewer's entire premise, saying he actually moved from a compact mini PC setup back to a traditional case because the small form factor ran too hot and was a nightmare to clean and disassemble. Directly contradicting the smaller and simpler is always better undertone of the video. But then a different commenter offered what might be the most useful piece of advice in the entire thread, warning that ergonomic chairs are not automatically the answer either, and that you specifically need one that hugs your body properly. Test it in person before buying, because a chair that looks great in reviews can still leave your lower back and hips feeling empty and unsupported if the fit is wrong for your body type. That is a nuance the original video completely skipped, and it might be the single most practical piece of advice in this whole conversation.
One more comment deserves attention here because it complicates the entire narrative the reviewer built. A commenter pointed out that budget gaming chairs are genuinely the problem. Cheap synthetic leather that traps heat and peels fast, but that if you have the money for premium brands like Corsair or Razer chairs, the complaints mostly disappear. That reframes this entire trend discussion from gaming chairs are outdated to cheap gaming chairs were always bad and people are only now admitting it, which is a very different and much more controversial claim.
And honestly, once you sit with that reframe for a second, it starts to feel like the real story here is not about gaming chairs versus office chairs at all. It is about the entire price tier of budget peripherals getting exposed across the board. Think about it. Nobody in these comments is defending the cheap version of anything. Nobody is out here saying the $40 knockoff gaming chair still holds up. The defense only shows up once real money enters the conversation. Premium brand names, tested in-person fit, mesh construction instead of vinyl. That is not really a rejection of gaming chairs as a category. It is an admission that an entire generation of PC builders got sold budget garbage dressed up as aspirational lifestyle furniture, and it took nearly a decade of sweaty backs and peeling pleather for people to say it out loud in a comment section, instead of just quietly switching chairs and never mentioning it again.
There is also a quieter emotional layer running underneath all of this chair discourse that the video does not fully address, but the comments absolutely do. Multiple commenters describe their gaming chair purchases in terms of major life milestones, not just product decisions. One person recalls the price of a leather chair given to them 9 years ago and does the mental math on what that number represents now, essentially treating the chair as a time capsule for where they were financially and emotionally back then. Another commenter frames the entire ergonomic chair switch as something that only happened because he now has a wife and kids, which turns a furniture decision into a proxy for an entire life stage transition. That is the real undercurrent running through every single trend in this video. These are not just component choices. They are markers of who these people used to be versus who they are now. And that emotional weight is exactly why the comment section got this passionate over something as mundane as chair material.
Trend 4 takes us into pure enthusiast territory, overclocking. And this section of the video is genuinely important because it explains a technical shift that most casual viewers have probably never had explained clearly. The reviewer breaks down why overclocking dominated PC culture for years, specifically pointing to Intel running roughly a decade of quad-core processors under its Core i7 branding without meaningful core count increases, and AMD's early Ryzen generations, the 1000, 2000, and even parts of the 3000 series, sometimes failing to hit their officially advertised boost clocks out of the box. In that environment, squeezing extra performance manually through overclocking was not a hobby. It was often necessary just to get the performance you were promised on the box.
But modern CPUs and GPUs, according to the reviewer, are simply too well optimized out of the box now for overclocking to matter the way it used to. The performance gap between a stock chip and an aggressively overclocked one has shrunk to the point where better cooling or a higher quality motherboard alone can erase most of the difference. This is where the video pivots to something genuinely more relevant for today's audience: undervolting, which reduces power draw and heat while trying to preserve close to stock performance. The reviewer specifically mentions doing this on his own mini PC to manage thermals and power consumption, which is a much more universally applicable skill than chasing benchmark records ever was.
And the comments here are where this video accidentally turns into a legitimate technical resource. One incredibly detailed comment breaks down the difference between overclocking and undervolting in plain terms, explains that modern CPUs and GPUs lean toward undervolting because stock performance is already strong, but specifically calls out that RAM overclocking is very much alive, especially with DDR5 kits using SK Hynix dies, where a stick rated at 5,600 megatransfers per second at CL36 can sometimes be pushed to 6,000 at CL32 with a voltage bump. That same commenter goes even further into GPU memory overclocking, using the Radeon RX 7900 GRE as a specific example, explaining that its 256-bit bus width limits bandwidth, and that overclocking VRAM from 2250 MHz to 2500 MHz can net roughly an 11% bandwidth increase, effectively unlocking free performance on a card whose core is stronger than its memory bus allows it to express. That is a legitimately controversial and nuanced take buried in a YouTube comment section, arguing overclocking is not dead, it just moved from CPU chasing to targeted memory tuning based on where the actual bottleneck lives. If that is not a mic drop rebuttal to the entire premise of Trend 4, I do not know what is.
And now Trend 5, the one that might generate the strongest universal agreement across the entire comment section: 7.1 surround sound gaming headsets. This trend exploded specifically around the rise of PUBG in 2017, when suddenly every peripheral category got PUBG-branded hype, mice for PUBG, monitors for PUBG, keyboards for PUBG, and headsets for PUBG loaded with virtual 7.1 surround marketing. The reviewer's core argument is refreshingly blunt: virtual 7.1 on a headset is functionally impossible to deliver properly, because true 7. One surround requires physically separated speakers positioned around your body, and no headset, regardless of price tier, budget, or premium, can replicate that with two drivers pressed against your ears. He calls it what it really was: a marketing buzzword more than an actual functional upgrade, and says gamers have largely moved on to studio monitoring headphones or in-ear monitors that prioritize raw, accurate sound reproduction over gimmicky spatial simulation.
The comments here read almost like a support group for people who got burned by this exact marketing claim. One person called Virtual 7.1 the most, in his words, FOMO garbage experience he ever had with gaming peripherals, saying he tried multiple gaming headset generations, was always curious enough to turn the feature on, and every single time it performed worse than expected, eventually landing on wired IEMs as the actual answer. Another commenter admitted buying a Razer 7.1 headset specifically for PUBG and describing the sound as, quote, terrible, before eventually returning to studio-grade headphones exclusively. Someone else pointed out that real 7.1 surround only makes sense through actual speaker setups, directly echoing the reviewer's technical explanation. And one commenter added a detail the video didn't even mention, that virtual 7.1 processing actually increases audio latency, which for competitive shooters is a direct performance disadvantage on top of being sonically inferior. That is a legitimately strong argument nobody in the original video brought up, and it might be the single most damning piece of evidence against this entire trend.
What makes this particular trend collapse feel so complete compared to the other four is that there is almost zero pushback in the comments defending it. Compare that to gaming chairs, where premium buyers pushed back hard, or overclocking, where the DDR5 and VRAM tuning explanation basically rescued the trend's reputation entirely. Nobody is out here defending Virtual 7.1. Not a single comment says the feature actually helped them win a gunfight, actually helped them locate footsteps more precisely, actually justified its markup. Instead, you get people describing it almost like a shared trauma, buying two separate USB-powered 7.1 headsets and having both experiences feel, in their words, like garbage, or immediately trying to figure out how to disable the feature entirely, because the processed sound made positional audio worse instead of better. When an entire comment section agrees this uniformly on a single point, that tells you the marketing gap between promise and delivery on this one was probably the widest of all 5 trends combined. Wider even than the RGB markup or the custom loop price inflation, because at least those two delivered a visual result you could actually see and enjoy. Virtual 7.1 promised a competitive advantage and delivered, by nearly unanimous account, a worse listening experience with added lag on top.
There is also a smaller but genuinely funny side trend buried in the replies here worth mentioning. Several commenters brought up the era of bass vibrating headsets, the kind that used haptic rumble, synced to low-end audio frequencies, popular specifically among people playing competitive shooters like Crossfire back in the day. Nobody claims that trend was good either, but it is a reminder that 7.1 surround was not even the only audio gimmicks sold to gamers during that window. It was simply the loudest and most widely marketed one, riding directly on PUBG's explosive popularity in a way that made the marketing nearly impossible to avoid if you were shopping for a headset at all in 2017 or 2018.
So here's the pattern that emerges once you zoom out across all 5 trends, and this is honestly the most interesting part of the whole conversation. Every single one of these trends followed the exact same life cycle. They exploded during a period when the underlying technology was genuinely inadequate, or when the market was young enough that consumers had no reference point for what actually mattered. RGB exploded because plain components looked boring in an era obsessed with visual identity. Custom water cooling exploded because AIO coolers were unreliable and underdeveloped. Gaming chairs exploded because the alternative was literally plastic stools. Overclocking exploded because stock CPU performance genuinely lagged behind advertised specs. And 7. Surround exploded because gamers desperately wanted any competitive edge they could buy, whether or not the technology could actually deliver it.
And every single one of these trends died, or at minimum evolved, for the exact same underlying reason. The baseline technology got good enough that the workarounds stopped being worth the cost, whether that cost was money, comfort, maintenance risk, or actual functional performance. That is not a coincidence. That is a maturity curve playing out across an entire product category simultaneously. And honestly, it says something bigger about consumer tech in general. Trends do not usually die because people got smarter. They die because the underlying products got better, which means whatever trend is currently dominating your feed right now, whatever build you are FOMOing into today, is probably going through the exact same life cycle in real time. And you likely will not notice it happening until someone makes a video exactly like this one in 5 years, roasting the exact setup you are proud of right now.
One commenter accidentally summed up the entire 9 years better than the video itself did, describing a journey from a Xeon workstation build in 2017 running dual GPUs and SLI inside a massive full tower case with maximum everything, all the way down to a tiny HP mini workstation in 2026 that barely gets used a few times a week, with one of his 2 monitors now permanently claimed by his wife. That arc, from maximalist chaos to minimalist restraint, is basically the entire thesis of this video compressed into one paragraph, and it is also, whether these commenters realize it or not, basically the story of adulthood colliding with a hobby that used to define their entire identity.
So which one of these 5 actually surprised you the most? And more importantly, which trend do you think is quietly living through this exact same rise and fall curve right now without anyone noticing yet?
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.